Our Across the Aisle segment tonight, President Obama delivered his final legacy speech last night in Chicago. Take a look at the touching moments.
For the past 25 years, you have not only been my wife and mother of my children, you have been my best friend. You took on a role you didn't ask for, and you made it your own, with grace and with grit and with style and good humor. Malia and Sasha, under the strangest of circumstances, you have become two amazing young women. Of all that I have done in my life, I am most proud to be your dad.
Joining me now, Democratic strategist Carter Turner. Carter, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Carter, you know I don't agree ideologically with President Obama. I don't think there's very few policies, let's say, that I would line up the same as President Obama, but this was very touching. I think one of his legacies that we shouldn't forget is he has a very lovely family. His marriage seems to be happy and wholesome, and his children are beautiful.
Yeah, I agree. I was expecting you to be critical of his comments towards his family, quite honestly, and I was going to say,
there's nothing to be critical about. It was beautiful.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's family values, absolutely. He's got a good family. He's a loyal dad, and he's a loyal husband, and he's a model for a lot of us. So.
Right, and I think he's exactly right. Raising kids in that circumstance is a very strange circumstance. I think you could very easily raise children who did not turn out to be self-sufficient or well-rounded. And his daughters, I mean, we've seen them grow from adorable little girls into lovely young women. He certainly should be very proud of that. He and Michelle both. Carter, but the substance of his speech, putting that stuff aside, I think he's a good man in that sense, but the substance of his speech, I can't wrap my head around, because it seems to me that his view of his own legacy is quite different than how not only I view it, but how history is going to view it.
Well, we'll find that out. I mean, it takes a few years for us to be able to really assess the effectiveness of anybody's presidency. There was a very small portion of that speech last night that talked about his accomplishments. He talked about steady economic growth. He talked about reducing our dependence on carbon-based energy sources. The stimulus probably helped keep us, most definitely helped keep us out of a recession and maybe even a depression. But really, the crux of the speech was about where we are as a nation right now. And I think the other great thing about Obama, policy aside, is his ability to frame for us our moments in history, where we are. He did this in 2008 in his speech on race relations in this country.
Right, I mean, undoubtedly his strength is his speaking ability. He's an incredible speaker. I mean, he compels an entire crowd, no matter how many people it is. It's incredible. The crux of his speech was about himself, though. He mentioned himself 75 times. That's unprecedented, to use his own word. But Carter, I don't even think we have to wait a couple years in certain circumstances to see the effectiveness of a presidency. He was talking about racial divide last night, and this is what he said in short form. He said a post-racial America was never realistic. It remains potent and divisive, but things are better now than what some folks say, even if we're not where we need to be. Carter, that's just inaccurate in my opinion. I mean, if you look at the polls from 2016, the past year, most Americans think race relations are worse than they were, and the concern over race relations is the highest it's been since 2001 when that data was first collected.
Well, but that's not necessarily the measurement of whether it's true. I mean, there are people in this country who think the Earth is 6,000 years old. That doesn't make the Earth 6,000 years old.
What's the measure then?
I mean, well, I think the measurement is income. I think minorities in this country, African Americans in particular, have elevated in income. I think unemployment is improved.
I mean, have you seen the unemployment rate for African Americans, particularly African Americans in my generation, millennial generation? It's enormous.
I have, but I also saw it in 2008 when he came in, and it's improved, and that was his point. But again, the crux of the speech last night was really about we as Americans need to start forming some solidarity, that this democracy only works if we're committed to understanding one another, walking in other people's shoes. And it wasn't just walking in the shoes of black people in urban centers, but also walking in the shoes of white working class people in rural America, where I live. I think that's exactly the message right now. I mean,
I understand that. I think that's part of... That's part of what makes him
I
such a
was gonna
compelling
say, I was
speaker, because he talks so well about this stuff theoretically, but when it comes to it practically, he's had 8 years in the office of the presidency. He's had 8 years to enact policies that actually would make us believe what he's saying is true. He hasn't done that. When you look at white working class, people are worse off than they were 8 years ago. I mean, I'm going to have to repeat it again. African Americans' jobs worse off than they were 8 years ago. He's added 10 million people to food stamps since he became president. That's 32% higher than the president before him.
Liz, the economy has steadily grown over the last 8 years. That is indisputable. Look, working class Americans are having a tough time because factory jobs are leaving, factory jobs are being automated. That's something that we have to address as a country. And I'm not going to say that he's done a great job about that problem, but neither did George Bush.
He's put in place tons of regulations. He's raised taxes. He's made the environment for small business owners impossible. He's even made it impossible for these larger manufacturing companies to do well here, to thrive here. They have to go somewhere else if they want to even make a buck.
That's simply not true, Liz. He lowered taxes for the poor in this country, raised taxes on the top 1%, as he should have. Probably should have raised it more. Look,
Carter, but do you hear what you're saying when you say he raised taxes on the top 1%? Those are the people that are hiring.
Yeah.
Those are the people that are creating jobs. Those are the people that own the manufacturing companies. If the taxes are higher on them, they're going to go somewhere else.
Well, George Bush lowered taxes on them and the economy sunk. So that's not necessarily a correlation there. I mean, taxes are higher than they were, and the stock market's much higher than it was 8 years ago. So the wealthy are doing fine in this country despite paying more in taxes than they were 8 years ago.
Right, that's because the wealthy have that cushion of being wealthy. It's the middle class and the lower income people who are struggling. And we see, I mean, you can look at the labor force participation rate. More people have stopped looking for a job, have given up the hope that President Obama promised them. They don't think they can find a job, and they've removed themselves from the workforce. I mean, that to me is more of a measure of whether people are better off than they were 8 years ago than any other type of rhetoric that comes from President Obama's mouth, even if it sounds pretty when he says it. Carter, I'd love to keep talking about this. There are a lot of other topics that he covered in the speech last night, but they're telling me I'm out of time, so I got to go. Thanks for being here.